at 4 o'clock. And if you are tuning into this live, then I question your social life if you are tuning into this live on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. But if you are, thank you so much. I did not promote this conversation at all. I thought about doing it, but then I was like, no, I want to let this sort of be a surprise. So if you're watching this live, you might be in for a surprise if you know me and my guest. As all our episodes are, before I introduce him, all our episodes are brought to you by the Downtown Tavern, 208 North Liberty Street in downtown Jackson. It is Friday at 4 o'clock. In another life, I would have been at the Downtown Tavern. I spent about a decade going to that bar on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. And I can tell you this, there's not a better bar experience in Jackson or West Tennessee than the Downtown Tavern. Named one of the top 15 best dive bars in the state of Tennessee recently. So please go check it out. If you are ever traveling through West Tennessee, the Downtown Tavern it's a gem in downtown Jackson. It's been a stalwart in that area that is undergoing a lot of change right now. All good, but the Downtown Tavern is still there. My guest today is someone that I have known for a long time, since I was about 15 years old. So close to 30 years. And like people do, since we live in an age of social media, it's easy to stay connected to people and keep up with people. And my guest and I have sort of moved in and out of each other's lives over the last 30 years. And I sent him a text message a few days ago, and I said, I really want to have you on the show to talk about faith. And the reason I wanted to have this particular person on is because, one, he's highly intelligent. I've always respected that about him. Two, he has been in the ministry for the better part of his entire life, since he was 20 years old. He's recently taken a break from ministry, and I don't know all the details about that. I just think it's it's really good timing to have this conversation, because I think sometimes having conversations about faith with people who are still in the ministry, they may not be as authentic as they would like to be. So I think this is prime for a really good conversation with my former youth minister, Timmy Nussbaumer, who goes by Tim. I don't want you to correct me just yet. If I call you Timmy a lot, I'm sorry. It's out of love, though. Tim,
all right.
How are you doing today?
Doing great, man. Hey, I'm back in Clarksville. And so just so you know, I get called Timmy quite a bit these days, because the folks that knew me back in the day, they, no matter what, they still call me Timmy too. So it's all good, man.
Just to give a little background, you're recently back in Tennessee, but you spent how many years in New Jersey before you came back to Tennessee?
Almost 18. Wow. Yep.
And we'll visit some of that in this conversation, because I think it's important, especially as we sort of like dive deep into the weeds of, I use the term faith. I think our context for faith, you and I both, is probably more geared toward Christianity, but I want to explore the overall topic of faith as well. But, in conversations, you kind of tend to lean on the things that you're familiar with. So I'm sure that Christianity will play a big role in this conversation. So 18 years in Jersey. Before that, you were in Georgia. But before you were in Georgia, you were in Tennessee, and you were my youth minister. So let's just start light, because this conversation is going to get super heavy. Do you have any specific memories of Calvary Baptist Church from the years of 95 to about 2001 that just still stand out?
Oh, man. Gabe. So first of all, let's be honest, I had no business being a youth pastor at the ripe old age of, I think I started out, I was barely 20, and Calvary kind of thrust me into this youth pastor position. And I had two people in particular in the youth group, one by the name of Michael Dennison and the other by the name of Gabe Hart, that gave me a run for my money in youth ministry. And lots of memories of you guys giving me, you kind of gave me a lot of, you definitely made me earn my money, but to this day, Robin and I, my wife, we still die laughing at just some of the things that we went through. I'm trying to think of some of the best memories that we had were, of course, I mean, like it's kind of cringy to think some of the things that we went through. One of them was, of course, Judgment House.
Oh,
Yeah, I know you cringe at that as well. If you're not familiar with Judgment House was this thing that we did every year around. It was like a church's version of a haunted house, but the idea was that you would take groups through to basically literally scare the hell out of them, right? And literally, yeah. And you would take a group through, and you would take them through. Gabe, I remember you were one year Satan.
3 years.
3 years. Sorry, 3 years. I still tell people this story because you were very convincing. I don't know, pretty natural, I think, as Satan. So I don't know if that was like foreshadowing for the years to come. But Gabe, what you would do is you would sometimes, if I remember correctly, you would get the names of people ahead of time in the group, and as they would come in, you would kind of break the what do they call it, like the fourth wall or the third wall?
Yeah.
And you would walk and get in their face, and you would break the script, and you'd get right in their face, and you'd be like, wait a minute, don't I know you? And then you like lean in and go, yeah, I think I know you. And I remember watching this one guy, and like he was shaking, he was so scared, and then you would just like go right back to your script. And it was amazing how many people we would have that would like pray the prayer of salvation. Because I think I would too, like after a moment like that.
It's funny, and I don't want to be disrespectful of this type of theology, but I almost remember us counting these like records of commitments or rededications or salvations, almost like George Costanza. And who was the guy in the garage on Seinfeld when they were selling computers for Frank, and they would ding the bell. They would keep up with how many computers that's what it felt like. We were doing, like making a sales chart over how many people we got to buy.
800-900 decisions for Christ. But like, we'd get them in a room after they had gone like literally through like a version of hell and then through heaven. And it's like, how many of you don't want to go to hell? Okay, I'll raise my hand, and I'll say whatever I need to say. And so, yeah, totally.
It's so sensationalized, like so emotional. And like, it's funny because I wanted to keep like the first 5 minutes light, but we've just like stepped right into like this huge theological discussion.
I know. Yeah, I didn't even mean to do that, but that's
okay. Because Judgment House in and of itself is just a ridiculous idea thinking back on it. But man, we did it. Hey, and we did it well. Like,
I know.
We did it well.
When people ask me, like, what are things like when you look back, like, what are you the most proud of, or what are you most ashamed of? Like, literally, the answer is both. Like, because we did it really, really well, and yet I'm the most like proud of it and the most ashamed of it, like all at the same time.
That's right. Production value A+. Right?
Oh yeah, and it was also, I don't know if you remember, it was that moment where I realized that I like could kind of spend whatever I wanted, because no matter what, the donations, like we didn't charge anything, but we had that donation box at the front, and no matter what we spent, we would always have like money coming in that would offset the expenses. And like, there's that moment where I realized, oh man, we can pretty much do like whatever we could imagine we could do. And so each year it just kept getting like bigger and bigger. And so again, like, yeah, we did it well, and I look back and I cringe as well. It's like, oh man.
What's amazing about the 90s and Christian culture is we would joke about it back then, is any type of Christian artistry, right? Like music, movies, even Judgment House, it was a direct ripoff of something in the secular world. But we were just like, let's just take this. This is working out here. We're not going to do anything new. We're just going to like steal the idea and put a Christian spin on it. So, hey, you can go to the haunted house in Medina, sure, but then come to Judgment House after that.
Yeah, and we'll do it better.
We're going to make you cry and worry about going to hell tonight when you go to bed.
Exactly. All right. So what about you though? I got to ask the question to you. What do you remember about those youth group days?
Man, like the one, it's funny because thinking back, I will think like, how did we like, how was that legal? How did we do that? How was that allowed to be done? The first one being, I think, when you at like probably 20 years old or 21 drove all night literally to Palm Beach, Florida, 15 passenger van, just a bunch of teenagers, no supervision. I mean, you were driving, another adult was in the front seat, everybody else just in the back, nobody watching. Overnight, you were taking no-dos, which are probably illegal now, right? Like back in the 90s, everything, it was probably ephedra. I think in like 2004, they just said, we can't sell this over the counter anymore. It's too dangerous. You were mainlining that all the way down there.
100%.
And all night, like you didn't sleep.
No. Yeah. I remember going up to New Jersey, and I told our student pastor, I remember telling him, like, listen, like, you'll be fine as long just don't do anything that I did, because if you do anything that I did when I was student pastor, like, I'm gonna have to fire you, because like I would totally fire me.
I mean, I think back even to things like lock-ins, which every youth group did lock-ins. We weren't the only one, but even like lock-ins, how do you keep track of, and as someone who has a 17-year-old daughter now, like, how do you even keep track of teenagers in this giant building? It's all night. There's, 30 Sunday school rooms spread out. We've got, like, at Calvary, we had like 4 different sections of the building that were sectioned off by doors. I mean, it was nuts. Like, we just had to have a lot of trust, or I guess you did, in what we were doing,
trust, or just pure like naivete, just that's more like what it was.
What's funny is I've run into people recently, even the guy that I co-hosted a radio show with here in Jackson last summer a lot. And he's actually part of this platform that we're on right now as well, Chuck Walker. As we were getting to know each other as adults, I would give people my background sometimes, because if they know me now and they didn't know me then, they would have no idea that I was ever really that heavily involved in church. And I would like, I was a youth minister, I was a deacon, I went to Calvary, like I was in it. And Chuck was like, wait, I went to Calvary in 99. I was like, really? And he like lived in Crockett County. And I've come across like 3 or 4 adults just in the last year who are like, yeah, I visited Calvary in 99. Like, we were running for a church that wasn't that big. We were running like 200, 250 college and youth, right? Like every Wednesday night for the bridge. Like, we would do this outreach. We play these games, had the stage, music, bands, lights, smoke machines.
Oh yeah.
Like, come on. We're the cool Christians. Like, come to our church.
Remember we had people like rappelling from the rafters, literally. Yeah. Yes. It was smoke machines. It was nuts.
It's so funny because, and people watching this know, and Laura, I'm my partner is the daughter of the pastor at Calvary at the time, and she and I talk all the time about those days. And I've reconnected with Michael, who you mentioned earlier, and we talk all the time about those. It was really just 4 years. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, it was about 4 years. It's a very small part of my life, but it's probably what I remember the most, or at least have the most emotional connection to.
Sure.
And I we'll explore some of that in a minute, but I do want to sort of like take a turn. I want to keep reflecting on that time period. What was something during that time period, and it may be Judgment House, but you can't use that one because you already did, that you look back on now and you think, oh my God, I got that wrong. Like that, either it could be an approach, it could be a belief, it could be whatever it is. But you look back 30 years ago, you think, I cannot believe I ever believed that or did that.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot. I think even if it's not Judgment House, I think it's probably the whole like theological framework that even undergirds Judgment House, if that makes sense. It's that, it's kind of this idea that that Christianity is this package where it's a presentation where you kind of present it to somebody, they pray a prayer, they accept it, and now they're in. And we still see, honestly, like we see a version of this that's still like alive and well today. And I think I think I really bought into that like hook, line, and sinker. And Judgment House is kind of the it's the embodiment of that, but like really it's what it's what we did as a youth group, like all the time. And it's taking faith and Christianity and putting it into consumerism, if that makes sense. It's commercializing faith and putting it into a package that that makes it almost makes Christianity like easy to swallow. And you mentioned it earlier, Gabe, when you talked about like smoke machines and big games and the bridge. That was really youth group in the 90s, if you remember correctly. Like Willow Creek, does that ring a bell? Like Willow Creek was like that's where we got all that stuff. Like Willow Creek was like the big mega church back in the day. And I remember they put out this book of games that you could do. And I remember getting this book and thinking like, oh, this is going to be amazing. And we took that book and we did a lot of those games in the church as a way to, to get those big crowds into the church so that we could, give the gospel and get people to pray the prayer so that they would accept Christ and get them into the church. So that like whole like theology, I think I bought into that like hook, line, and sinker. When I read the New Testament now, I look at and I look at that and it's almost unrecognizable to what I look at that that American brand of Christianity. Does that kind of make sense? What I'm saying? Okay, so that's.
Looking back, do you think, because the way that we did things, the way all churches did it, I don't know that youth groups are as popular now. They don't seem to be. They don't seem to be as big. It's more these para-church organizations. Young Life seems to still be sort of big here. Youth groups within a church, and the church in general is not as big as it was 30 years ago either.
Right.
But do you think the way that we, and I'm going to say that we presented this idea of faith, something that we said, and at the time, for me at least, believed was very valuable, right? We hold this in high regard, but then we present it in a way that is, like you said, commercialized or consumer based, when it's something that is so much more complicated and nuanced than whatever that is. Do you think we're at a place now in 2024 where when you just sort of like shotgun out these ideas of quote unquote faith to a mass audience, that there's really no way to grapple with what that entails in a way that's productive? Does that make sense, what I'm saying?
Do you mean like it's hard to like mass, like to communicate it to the masses, or?
Yeah. I mean, like, if you're going to do it the right way, like if you're really going to address the idea of faith, spirituality in the right way, is it something that can just be done in this large presentation?
Well, I would say if you're going to do it well, no. And so what people settle for is to do it in a watered down way. And that is the way that it's being done now, often, in order to get it out, to the masses. And that's where, this is probably, I'm not sure if we want to go there, but like, I think this is where you get where mega churches and where like a lot of the growth is happening right now, is where you see the unholy marriage right now of like faith and politics in our country, is because the message of Jesus itself isn't easy to swallow, right? Like if you look at like the Sermon on the Mount, if you look at the Beatitudes, the message of Jesus itself is not an easy one. And so we've substituted it out for things that are a lot easier to swallow. And so if you look at like a lot of the churches that are growing super fast, and hear me, this is not true of all churches. This is not an indictment on every church that's growing, but a lot of the churches that are growing in our country right now are churches that have married politics, like in particular right-wing politics, the MAGA movement in particular, with the Jesus message. And those churches are the ones that tend to be growing right now because the actual gospel message itself is not popular. And so, to your point, I don't think it's an easy thing. It's not an easy message to get out to the masses.
Yeah, I've said, and I may have commented and maybe it was Dr. Jackson, I'm not sure. I commented on somebody's something they shared on Facebook like a year and a half ago, and it was something the SBC did, Southern Baptist Convention did again, and it is either an anti-female something they presented or anti-LGBTQ. And I just remember saying, like, if they keep going in this way, they're not going to be around in 50 years. Like that's they cannot continue to just. You good?
Sorry.
They cannot. Oh, you're fine. They cannot continue to like draw these hard lines and not have some type of grace or graciousness as they evolve with culture. Like they're going to be dead. But then somebody kind of made the point you did. They were like, they may lose members, but they're going to become more extreme in their beliefs, or they're almost getting sequestered to a corner. And you're right. This marriage of I'll just call it Christian nationalism, this marriage of politics and faith, has, I think maybe the greater church is shrinking, but you're right. These particularly specific churches are getting bigger. But do you think it's more of like an identity also? Like, hey, I really relate to what they're saying. Politics is something I can understand, so I'll just mesh it with this as well.
I think so. There's a guy by name, I think his name is Ryan Burge, or I think that's the way you pronounce it. He was a pastor, and he's been studying this for quite a while. He actually just shut down his church last month, and it was kind of sad for him, but he refused to kind of go that direction, and as a result actually had to shut down his church because he refused to kind of go the MAGA way. And that's one of the things that he's documented, is that like a lot of pastors that have refused to kind of go that extreme right-wing politics have really struggled because of that. And one of the things he said is there's this thing happening right now in the evangelical world in our country where it's like a purity thing. And by purity, I mean, there are folks that are looking at the church, and if you're not following in line, meaning if you're not going to like toe this like far right agenda to the letter of the law, like you're going to be called out for that, and you're going to be called out as not being truly Christian, and you're going to be pushed out. And we're seeing that in some pretty extreme ways right now, and it's really, really unhealthy. Have you heard of there's this one author, journalist, Megan Basham, I think is her name, that just wrote a book called Shepherds for Sale. And the book is basically calling out a lot of evangelicals, including Tim Keller, Russell Moore, like just normal, evangelicals, saying that they've sold their soul to liberals for like very normal things, like saying like vaccines are a good thing, like COVID vaccines are good, or for saying that maybe we should actually take climate change seriously. She basically is calling out all these evangelicals that are saying things and saying like that is an example that they've kind of sold their soul to the devil, basically. That's kind of where we are right now, is that if you even question anything that the far right might say, then you're compromised and you have no part in the evangelical world. And if that's where we are, we're really we're kind of in a bind right now.
Yeah, and I think that's why the conversation like these are so important, because it doesn't seem like there's room for them within certain types of church context. I haven't been in a church in a long time, but that from the outside looking in, there's not room for just admitting, hey, I don't know if I believe. I'm going through a time right now where like I question all of this stuff. I can even remember, and we'll get into this more in a minute, I can even remember as a kid thinking that, but like, man, who do I tell that to? Because then what? Right?
Oh, totally. And listen, like I've been in part of like a community group, a small group, very recently in an evangelical church. And one of the things I told them, and I really, really believe this, to me, it's not, especially when it comes to politics, it's not about whether you lean left or whether you lean right. It's about a posture of like, can you have conversations with your other in a way that is open, where you can have an open dialogue and listen to another person and receive without being like this. And I feel like in our country right now, we've lost the ability to do that. We've lost the ability to dialogue with our other, and in a way that fosters dialogue, and in a way that that where we can continue to have a relationship with other people. And I think that is a real problem. And that's that kind of purity thing that I was talking about earlier. We have this thing that says like, no, we've got to like rid my tribe of anyone that doesn't believe exactly like I believe. And if you don't fall in line, then you've got to get out of here. And as a result, we create these echo chambers. And I think it's really, really unhealthy for not just the church. I think it's unhealthy for our country as well.
Before we dive into sort of like the personal half of this conversation, I want to ask you something, because we spent some time talking about politics and religion mixing. You were in New Jersey for 18 years, and you've been back in Tennessee for what, 2, something like that?
Yep.
Is it the same up there, the mixing of the politics and the religion, or is it way more intense down here?
It's a little bit different. So like when we moved to New Jersey to start churches, we knew it was going to be a little bit tricky. First of all, because we were planting as a Southern Baptist church in New Jersey, which automatically that's a challenge, right? So when we moved, we said, listen, if we plant a church in New Jersey, if 5 years from now, if our church is all Republicans, for example, we'll know that all we did was reach like transplanted Midwesterners and Southerners that went into New Jersey. And I can tell you, there are a lot of churches in New York City and New Jersey that are Southern Baptist churches that are just like that. And, that's fine. I'm not, there's a need for that, I guess, that, for churches that are like that. That was not like what we wanted to do. We wanted to be a church that was reaching actual folks that like were born and raised in New Jersey. And so we made a real effort to kind of distinguish ourselves and to be distinct from politics in that way. And so our heart was really to reach across the aisle and to be a diverse church, politically, racially, in all those ways. And by the grace of God, we did that. And it was probably our biggest challenge, but it was also our biggest strength. And so 10 years in, we were in our church on any given Sunday in a row, you would have a diehard Democrat sitting next to a diehard Republican, worshiping together. And it was kind of great. It was challenging, but it was really, really, it was nice to see that, because it really created an interesting dynamic, because they were able to say like, hey, we worship the same God, even though we don't see eye to eye on all these issues. Your question was, is it different in the South? I think it is different because, and I'm sure there are churches that have a little bit more of that diversity. I just haven't really seen that as much yet down here. It seems that in most white evangelical churches in the South, it's almost assumed that if you're a white evangelical and in the South, the assumption is that we're all on the same page and that we're Republican. And I think that's really, really like problematic. So much so, like we would have volunteer teams that would come up to like help us out in New Jersey, because like we were a very small church, and we would have to give them like orientation of like how they could best help us. And we would tell them, we would kind of tell them, hey, just so you know, I know that you're used to like everyone that's Christian being Republican. Just so you know, that's not the case here in New Jersey. And we would tell this to the teams. It was very difficult for them to kind of understand that. We had one guest speaker that came to our church you may even know this person's name. Have you heard of Denny Burke? I'm not sure if you've heard this name
I
before.
haven't. Mm-mm.
He's a kind of a controversial figure. He is the head of I think it's the center of I'm gonna blanking on the name, but like a gender. He's like one of the main like Southern Baptists like for gender equality or gender. He's one of the big complementarian guys like for the Southern Baptist Convention, and he's a big like blogger. He loves to like stir up controversy. Well, I didn't know that at the time, and he was like one of our speakers for like our church. And I told him, I like, as he's coming up to like preach on a Sunday morning, I'm like, hey, Denny, you need to understand the context of our church. Like, I know you're used to preaching at churches in the South, but you need to understand that our church is probably 65% Democrat. And so just be aware of that. And at the time, Barack Obama was president, I was like, so just be aware of your audience. And he's like, got it, Tim, no problem. I'll keep that in mind. So he gets up, and the very first thing he does in his sermon is he tells a joke where he totally trashes Barack Obama. That was the first thing he did in the sermon. And I had a lady that like got up immediately, like turned red and like walks out and screamed at me and walked out of the church. And I was like, so yes, the dynamic is very different between like the South and like the Northeast as far as that goes. And I think it's really, really challenging that the identity in particular that white evangelicals have with the Republican Party is really problematic. And it's been that way for 40 years now.
This is a great transition to the second half of this, because I can remember when I first started, I guess, if faith is keeping balls in the air, and I think about it in that way a lot of times, you got to just keep the balls all in the air. But if one drops, then you better really dial in and focus to try to keep the other ones in the air too. But if another one drops and you're in the middle, at some point, you're not going to be able to keep everything together. I also used an illustration about a Jenga tower with a friend the other day. Same idea, right? You pull one piece out, that everything's still intact, but you pull enough out, it's going to fall.
Yep.
In 2005, really 4 or 5, when politics seemed to start infiltrating the church. Yeah, maybe it's before that, maybe 03, 02. It really turned me off, because it was definitely a right-wing bend into the way that it was brought in. And it started to, I think, strip away some of the humanity, at least that I found in what the parts of, especially Jesus's life, that I connected with, that I even tried to sort of model myself after in my early 20s, which is like, let's take care of people who are vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
Let's sit down with people who are different than us. Like all of these things that seem to be democratic principles. And I wasn't even that much into politics, but I can remember when the Marriage Equality Act was coming down the pike and people were freaking out in the churches I was in. And that was the first thing for me that was like, why is this an issue? I didn't understand why this was such a big deal. Like that was my natural reaction. At that time, I don't think I knew anyone who was gay personally. Like I didn't have any type of like frame of reference for that. I just knew like, why are we pitching such a fit over this? How did this issue get so big? And that was the first thing that I kind of kicked out. Like, like, that's not a big deal. People who are in a committed relationship should still be able to come to a church. Like that was my first pull. Was there anything that for you personally, when it came to faith or even Christianity, that you'd been taught your whole life, but that you were like, I don't know about this now. I'm going to pull this out. This doesn't seem to make sense to me.
That like caused doubts in my faith, you mean? Or that or that maybe caused me to like deconstruct a little bit?
Maybe that's a better word. Because I didn't initially have doubts in my faith. I was just like, that doesn't seem to fit in in the tier that they're putting it for level of alarm for me. Okay.
Yeah, let me think. Yeah, I mean, I definitely. I think it wasn't one thing that like was like a 4 alarm fire for me that was like shocking. I think it's been several things over time, like that was kind of a slow build, if that makes sense.
Mhm.
Um, I think going to New Jersey was a big one, and I think I've mentioned this to you before. Like when I went to New Jersey, um, and you may remember this a little bit. Like back in the day, I was like, I was like a John Piper like fanboy, like Calvinist, like like Reformed, and like in my mind, I was going to go up to New Jersey, and I was going to like start like like a Calvinist, like very conservative, like church. That was in my mind what I was going to do. And when I went to New Jersey, the one of the first like on fire like Jesus following families that came to our church was the most opposite from that you could possibly imagine. And I'll just say his name. His name is Dean Zimmerman, like world-renowned philosopher at Rutgers University, and he had just wildly different views on just about everything, like politically, theologically, and what that did for me is it showed me that my worldview is really really small, and that like what I thought what I thought was true, I had to begin to look at things a little bit differently. And politically that was true as well. And so for what I think that did for me is it made me take a step back and go, okay, like maybe the things that I've believed all along, I need to take a step back and ask the question, is that really true? And um, so all of a sudden the things that I held as being sacred that like I couldn't question, I began to question. And so some of those things would have been like a young Earth creationism would be an example of like something that I always just believed and thought, oh yeah, the Earth is like very young and was created in 7 days, and now I don't necessarily have to believe that anymore, and so I didn't have to believe that, and so I went back and studied that, and came around and said like, okay, that's not something I actually believe anymore. I believe that God created the earth, but I don't have to actually believe that it was the earth is just 7,000 years anymore. And so for me it was much more gradual. It wasn't one thing. It happened over time. So does that kind of make sense? That so
Yeah, because I think the same thing happened to me, but it was a little bit more. I think my pieces were a little bit bigger. Like the 7 day. That's a great argument. Not argument. That's a great example. Um, I think even as a young adult, I had sort of not discarded that, but I think after reading a bunch of other types of literature, mythology, I was like, wait a second, everybody's got an origin story. Like this isn't literal. I was still a believer at that point, so I just sort of subscribed to kind of what you did, right? Like it was more of like a design deal, right? Like
yep,
was it intelligent design, things like that.
yep.
But then I think a big thing that fell off for me, I think, and this was the Jenga piece that I think everything felt like collapsed on, was the idea of hell.
Mm,
Okay. And for a long time, I was like, that doesn't like hell doesn't make sense to me.
mm,
Right. And so here's the thing too. And it doesn't sound like you've ever stopped believing in this story, where I think I have, because I think I couldn't make it make logical sense anymore to me. And I think the biggest piece was the hell piece, right? Like if there's this idea that God has created all of us
mhm.
and he sent his son, and if all of that is true, every single bit of that, and I don't even want to give examples of Africa and people who never hear him, because then there's like, oh, it says that you'll hear him. Well, no, you won't. Well, you see his work in creation. Well, that's not like shut up. There's always an excuse for something. So like I cannot imagine that if this is the way this goes, people are going to hell. So I sort of landed in my last days in church. I landed at a spot. Well, hell isn't real. we can create our own hell on earth if we make certain decisions or we choose not to believe, then we have just natural consequences to that. And eventually I just couldn't make any of it stand up anymore. And I was like, I don't believe any of this. Like,
Right.
this doesn't logically make sense to me anymore. Have you ever, it doesn't sound like have you ever been to a point like that or close to a point like that where you're like, I'm right at the edge and I've just got to like build this back up pretty quick?
I mean, absolutely. I mean, if you look at, was it Rob Bell that used to talk about like bricks, and he would talk about like, taking bricks out. I think he was the one that used to kind of look at it that way. I don't know that I've ever taken so many bricks out that like I've just lost my faith altogether, but I've certainly taken a lot of bricks out to where my theology looks almost nothing like it did. Certainly, but like if you went back to the time when I was like your youth pastor, like 30 years ago, my faith looks nothing like it did then. I'll give you a really clear example would be and we've talked about it a little bit, but like Calvinism is a great example. Like and again, no offense to anyone that's a Calvinist, but it's gonna be hard to say that and then explain what I'm about to explain. But like I used to be a very staunch Calvinist, and then similar to the doctrine of hell for you, I began to think through the logical consequences of this. And my philosopher friends, Dean Zimmerman, Blake Raber, and others in New Jersey, like very nicely, kind of got me to think through the logical consequences of this. And we're saying like, hey, think this through, that this is a God now that is creating people with no real libertarian free will, no real choice, for the sole purpose of living a life where they will die and spend an eternity being tortured forever. And no matter, you can dress that up and talk about like, oh, we all deserve death. You can dress it up with words. But like at the end of the day, is that a God that you actually want to worship? And I remember I really wrestled with that for a while until finally I got to the end of myself. And I said, like, honestly, it took me a while to get there, but like, I finally got to the point where I had to say it out loud, and it was hard for me at first, but I got to the point where I said, no, that God is actually a moral monster. And that was difficult for me to say, but I can say that now easily. That God is a moral monster, a God that creates people for the sole purpose of torturing them forever is a moral monster, like period. And that is a radically different place theologically than I was like 30 years ago. And so even though I may have not gotten to a place where, I became an atheist or an agnostic, I would say my faith journey has taken me to a place where my faith looks dramatically different than it did. And, it's funny because I hear a lot of fundamentalists that will brag about how they have not changed any of their beliefs in the past, 20, 25 years. Like my faith is exactly the same as it was, 20 years ago. And it kind of cracks me up because can you imagine like anybody else in any field going like, hey, I'm a scientist or I'm a mathematician and, or, whatever it is, and going like, hey, I believe, I'm exactly in the same place in this field as I was 20 years ago. Like that would be really, really odd and weird, but somehow we wear that as a badge of honor in our faith. And I think that's a shame, like surely we should be growing and growing and, changing and evolving and questioning. And doubt is part of I think doubt is a way that we grow and that God actually changes and grows us closer to him, actually.
There doesn't seem to be enough space within church culture. And again, I don't want to speak to it because I'm not in it currently. There doesn't seem to be a lot of space for that type of conversation. And I will say this, I want to ask you this too. Like if you look back, and yours was more gradual, it seems. Mine seemed to happen pretty intensely and pretty quickly. I think a lot was brought on by my divorce and what led to that, to where I had to step out of church for a while just for myself. And there was really in Jackson, there's really no place to go. At least for me, where I didn't feel judged or, whatever it was. So I stayed out for a long time. And during that time out is when all of those things just started to fall apart for me as far as the beliefs go. But I want to ask you this, you say that your belief system in God is completely different than it was 30 years ago. And it sounds like the Calvinist thing. I never realized that. I never would have taken you for that ever.
For Calvinist, really.
Really? No, like you never presented that way. Was that after Calvary or was that during Calvary?
I think it was during Calvary. Yeah, I was maybe getting into it like toward the end, maybe. But yeah, I was.
Well, look, I was an idiot. I didn't know anything. I mean, you know who I was when I was 18 or 19. I was just like, what cute girls are at Breakaway tonight.
Exactly.
when a faith, and this is where I keep landing as well. And we can bring this back to the political conversation too. When a belief system is that malleable, when one side can use it for one thing, when the other side can use it for the other thing, when we can shift our view of God so drastically, even if it is 20 years later. And this is me. I don't want to sound offensive, but this is where I get hung up. This is the part where I always get snagged when I feel like I might be inching a little bit back towards it. How can something like that is that shapeable for whoever wants to use it be real? Let me reword that. How can it be real in the way that it's presented as real?
Because it shifts so much, you mean?
Yeah, I mean, because if it starts here but it ends here, like it sounds like your view of God, it's like it's not the same God, right? Like the way that you see it, that's not the same being that it was 30 years ago.
I mean, I guess my answer to that would be like, isn't that how any relationship is, though? Right? Like, I mean, like if God is a relational being, like we would expect a relational being to change over time, just like any relationship with any person isn't the same over time. If you have a relationship with a person over 30 years, your relationship on day one is going to be different, and your perception of that person is going to change over time. It's not going to be the same. Your perception of that person on day one is going to be one thing. In 10 years, it's going to be different. In 20 years, it's going to be different. In 30 years, it's going to be different. The fact that it changes over 30 years should not be surprising. It's organic. It's relational. I don't think the fact that it changes means that it's not real. I think it just means that it's relational and it's organic. I don't think the absence or I don't think the fact that there is change means that it's not real, if that makes sense.
It does. And that's something like I logically understand. And I honestly agree with you. I think what trips me up, though, is that the belief system that surrounds it and the way that people interpret that system hasn't evolved as quickly, it seems. Like, so what you're saying is your view of God has evolved a lot, right? Now, and I don't want, and I haven't asked you these personal questions, but I just think about inclusivity within the church. And that's such a struggle, even with our local Methodist church here in Jackson. Right now, it's a struggle, right? Like there's these tensions.
Yeah.
So if we all have the idea, and I agree that things evolve over time, the more you learn, they shift, like you have a bigger idea of something. Why is that belief system so slow to come around? Or do you think things are happening in culture just too fast and the church is hasn't had time to catch up? And the reason I say that is because people get divorced in the church all the time and it's not a big deal. We can name any Old Testament thing right now.
Yep.
Why are these issues, women in ministry, LGBTQ, why are these such like hangups at this point?
Well, I mean, you're right. It takes a long time for anything to change, especially the church. It feels like is always kind of the last to catch up. And to your point, I think the culture is changing faster now than it has ever changed in history, right? Because of technology, and we're just moving at a much faster pace, and the church is it's not just not going to keep up, and that's to be expected. And so I think that's going to be a challenge, and that's okay. I think that's where we have to have a lot of grace, for each other, and that's hard for me, even to be honest. It's easy to look at other people and to go, man, I can't believe how backwards they are. I can't believe they still think that way or believe that way, and we have to be really, really careful and to give grace, where we can, because it is hard. I think it's just hard when a culture changes as fast as it is right now. I think it's hard for people to embrace change and to be comfortable with it.
Do you think that some resistance to that is how much of our personal identities are tied up into what we believe? I know this is a very general question. Into what we believe our religion or our faith is to us, and we assume it should be that to everyone else. Does that make sense? Like, go ahead.
I think I think we really I think we love certainty. I think we've made an idol out of certainty, and if you'll notice, people are really drawn to people, leaders, preachers that teach with this level of like, hey, this is the truth, and you don't have to believe it, but if you don't, you're wrong. And so, and as a result, you'll get people that follow leaders like that, and they will, they will tend to kind of like repeat those assertions in that same sort of like matter of fact way of like, hey, this is the truth, and if you don't believe it, then you're wrong as well. And so, because it makes us feel secure to like feel like we're a part of a system that is absolutely certain, because it doesn't feel shaky. But that doesn't mean it's real. It just makes us feel sort of secure. Especially, and I think the more that culture changes fast, the more we are drawn to that feeling of security, and that those people that have that like level of like certainty, if that makes sense.
No, it does. It does. What is the one thing? May not be one thing. What is one thing that the church collectively is getting wrong right now? I think in the way that culture is shifting, and that's such a broad question, because some churches are doing everything right, probably. But just in general, with the way that the church presents itself collectively as a whole right now in America, like I don't know what it's like globally, but in America, like, what is it? What's one thing it's getting wrong?
What's one thing the church is getting wrong right now collectively? There's a lot. Let me think. Like, what is one thing the church is getting wrong collectively? I mean, we've already talked about like the politics one. I think that's the Christian nationalism one. I think is probably the biggest thing right now. To kind of disconnect from politics. I still think that's the biggest one right now. I think right now there's a really big disconnect with just discipleship in general, like getting back to literally the words of Jesus. I remember Russell Moore, if you're familiar with him at all, is he was one of those that kind of got pushed out of the Southern Baptist Convention for being too liberal, which is really funny because he's not a liberal at all. He did recently, I think this is maybe a couple of years ago, did a sermon where he preached on the Sermon on the Mount, and a guy came up to him afterwards and said, hey, like when you said that we should love our enemies, he's like, I think like, he goes, I really didn't appreciate that. I think you're bringing your liberal politics into the church. And Russell said like, actually those aren't my words. Those were like literally the words of Jesus. And his the guy's response was, well, that may have worked back then, but like that doesn't work anymore. And so that's kind of where we are right now. Is I think we're at a point right now where Jesus himself is not popular with evangelicals, and that is a problem. That is a problem of discipleship. And so I think the biggest problem with the church right now in America is Jesus, is we don't like Jesus anymore. And like, I think if we want to see like a true revival of, in America, in the church, is we've got to simply get back to like real discipleship and get back to learn like really what did Jesus teach and get back into the way of Jesus. I know that's like a really simple, like basic answer, but I really, really believe that's the truth.
Well, and real quick, because I know we're coming up on an hour. First of all, the people on the right who hear you say that, not that any of them will be listening to this, but if they were, they would say, what do you mean we don't like? I think they believe that they are following the teachings of Jesus, but they just don't want to take the time to really understand what that is. And here's the second question. What would that look like if the church was doing that? Like, can you give some like concrete examples of what that would look like?
Yeah, I mean, just go back to like literally the words of Jesus, the the Sermon on the Mount, which is, welcoming the stranger. It's how you treat the poor. It's feeding the hungry. It's the literal words of Jesus. I feel like we get so caught up in culture wars right now. Great example right now is the Olympics. If you look at the Olympics, the two biggest things, right? You look at the opening ceremony with the, the whatever that was, the whole, whether it was the
Feast of Dionysus.
Yeah, Dionysus, or Lord's Supper, whatever it was, and then you've got the boxing controversy. Who was it? It was the Christians, the evangelicals, that immediately jumped on social media with like all this like outrage immediately, and that tends to be in. I don't think that's what most Christians like are known for or should be known for, but that's what we are known for. That's like what it appears that Christians are up to. Like when you talk to a person that is not really in tune with like the church, what Christians, and you ask, hey, what are Christians about? They'll be like, oh yeah, they're the ones that are like extremely mad about, transgender issues. They're the ones that hate gays. They're the ones that are very mad about like, all these culture war issues. That's like what we tend to be known for, rather than Christians being known for whatever you did for the least of these, how you treat the foreigner. Are you welcoming the immigrant? Are you visiting prisoners? Are you feeding the hungry? Those are the things that as a church we've got to get back to. And those aren't the sexy things. But those are the things that we're called to do. And that's what we've got to get back to as a church.
What you just mentioned, right? I think that's been my worldview for a long time. And I took it directly from my time in church, especially towards the end. Those are the sort of the principles that I try to live by. I don't do well, at least defending people who are marginalized, taking care of people who are marginalized, communicating, talking to, like understanding. I think like all of those things have been lost. And I think you're right. I think there's a perception that Christians are known for those things that you just mentioned, not the good things, but the ones
right,
like the freaking out. And also what offends me the most, honestly, is just a blatant disregard for truth. And I don't mean like a capital T truth. I mean,
right.
There seems to be no desire to find out the reality of something. They just want to have the reaction, right? To like shake the fist.
Yep.
But they're not interested in what's real, like what is true. And that's, it's kind of ironic as well. The last question, because we're coming up on an hour and I could go another two, honestly.
Yeah.
How much, especially now in 2024, when people are so isolated, we have computers in our hands and every other cliche you want to say about smartphones, we are incredibly isolated, I think, as a culture. Like it's so easy to kind of duck into our shells, right? What role does faith play now, and how important of a role like should it play moving forward? Like we can say individually, but also just collectively, right? Like in society, like what is the role of believing in something that you just don't have quite tangible proof of?
That's good. That's good. Well, I think community is the answer to your question, because when you have faith in something that you can't visibly see or touch, that's why you know, Jesus was the Word made flesh, right? It was that's what incarnation means, is that he came literally in the neighborhood. And so even God himself knew there was something that about incarnation that was really important, that he had to come in the flesh to this world. And so just as he came in the flesh, his church is here, and so inhabiting the world, and so his community is important as well. And so now, and I think we all felt this, Gabe, in the pandemic when we got like really isolated. And some people, by the way, never really came out of their shells, even since the pandemic, like we are still feeling kind of that isolation. I think now more than ever, people are craving community. And when it comes to faith, the way that we can experience in the transcendence of God, and the way that we can experience a deepening of our faith in a God that we can't see with our physical eyes or touch, is through real community, like an embodied believing community. And I think that is so important right now, is to really experience that.
Okay, well, and one more question.
Yeah.
You mentioned earlier in the conversation in New Jersey, you had like, members, staunch Republicans, liberal Democrats, but they're all in the same church. How do these fundamental questions of right and wrong, which both sides could defend using the Bible if they were pressed to, more than likely, cherry pick scripture, whatever the case may be, these big hot button issues in culture, same-sex marriage, women's health care, or depending on where you are, abortion, right? Like it's vernacular as well, like how people describe something, there's a connotation to it. How do those two people exist, right? One who are a staunch believer that these things are wrong, someone who thinks that they're fine and that we should, like, how do they exist or coexist in a community together? Like, what do you do with that as someone who's over a church? Like, honestly, like how does that work? Ideally.
So
how would that work?
So first of all, and I'm not even kidding, we could literally, this could be a whole nother podcast. Like literally this could be like another hour conversation. That's how much more material there could be on just that conversation. But I'll try to condense it into like another, here's the 60-second answer. I'm so passionate about that happening, because when that doesn't happen, which most of the time it doesn't happen, that's where we get echo chambers. You get groupthink because we already agree on everything. I think the best answers come when we get more people in the room that are on opposite sides of an issue, whether it be gun rights, abortion, whatever it is. If people come with the right mindsets, right? In other words, but if you don't have the right mindsets, it's impossible. And that's like this win-lose mindset of like, I'm right and you're wrong. Then you're not going to get to a good outcome. But if people come with an openness, to hear the other side and to listen, then even if you don't come to like a resolution, you're at least going to come to a place where I may come and, like, say you and I are having this argument and you're really, really pro-choice and I'm really pro-life, and we get to the end of the conversation and I don't change my mind and you don't change your mind. But at the very least, if we listen to each other, I might come away from the conversation with more nuance to my position. And I might be able to say, you know what, like, I'm still really, really pro-life, but I might have more nuance, and I can say, but you know what, I understand where Gabe's coming from now. and I have like a little bit softer edge now than I did before, and that's a win. And you would do the same. And I think when we do that, we're better, and we're treating each other with dignity and as human beings, and we're not dehumanizing each other. And when the church does that, we're healthier and we're better off, and we're modeling something for the rest of the country that honestly is not happening right now in our country, which puts us as a country in a really dangerous place.
No, that's great. Yeah. One more question. Is the belief system of Christianity, and I think you may have answered earlier, is it absolute or is it evolutionary? And what I mean by that is it constantly evolving in the way it can be interpreted? How much does it shift with the way culture shifts? Right? Like, I mean, like that's a hard, like that I feel like that's the tension that we're in right now.
Yep.
So is it evolutionary or is it absolute? I mean, because it's not a trick question, because I've always been taught that it's absolute.
I think it's evolutionary. We start with a garden, right, in Genesis, and we end with the city in Revelation coming down. When you look at the kingdom in the Gospels, how many times is the kingdom illustrated with organic language of like a seed, right? And a seed is organic, and it spreads and it grows. And so I don't think it's ever static. And so it changes and it grows. And so, of course, I think it does shift. That doesn't mean that the values shift. I don't think it means that, in other words, I don't think that like something one day is good and the next day it's bad. But I do think it means that things can look different, and things that will change over time, if that makes sense. So like values may stay the same, but the way it looks can change over time.
When I started reading the Bible, like I read any other type of literature, right? Symbolism, allegory, all of these things, it changed the way I viewed everything. And again, I may have just been in the wrong space to do that, because I think that was part of my tower collapsing, because there was no room for that. Would you consider that's the way the Bible is? Because some people will say it's like the Constitution. It is like, this is what it is, and there's no bending from that. Or is it, I like to think of it as allegorical, as a lot of other literature is, to where they're collectively, right, to the whole, there is a really a beautiful story, like for what it is, right? It's a really beautiful story, but it's more allegorical. It's more symbolic.
Totally. I mean, so shameless plug. We're starting a new podcast. Actually, the first episode drops on Tuesday, called Roots and Relevance, and we're actually going through the book of Jonah. And 30 years ago, when I would have taught Jonah to our youth group, I would have been like, "Oh, it's just a story, just detailing the life of Jonah." I would have never said it's an allegory. I would have never said it's like symbolic and all these things. And I would have missed all these really, really cool things in the story of Jonah. And now, like, you read it now and you see like all these really cool things. Like, you find out the fish starts out male, and then it goes to female, and then it goes back to male. Did you know that? Yeah, exactly. A gender changing fish. Who would have known that?
Oh, well, you're going to hell.
Exactly. And like, you find out all these amazing symbolic things are in the story. I would have never known that if I would have just like stuck to the, oh wait, Tim, aren't you just you don't believe it's just, literal wooden, like just take it like that and nothing else. So I feel like we've lost so much truth, like capital T truth in the Bible, by just taking it like literal, but not more than literal, if that makes sense. Like, we've taken it less than what it is, because it's more than what we've taken it for. And so I think there's more to it than what we've taken it for.
Man, this is great. Maybe we should do it again. Maybe we should just pick a topic and go, because like I said, I could keep going for another hour and a half, but we're over an hour. I do want to say it's so funny now. I tell Laura all the time that I feel like my life is divided into like 3 different lives, and I don't when I look back at this person I was when you knew me the most as a kid, it doesn't feel like me now. Like it feels like a different person. I'm just watching that from outside of it. But I will say this, as much as my belief system has changed, evolved, and then disappeared, and then maybe I'm sort of like trying to peek through and see what's in there now. That time that you were around and high school and all that, like it is still probably the most important time of my life, even looking back. And that's what I miss the most about not being part of a faith community. I miss the community, right? And I miss the idea of things sort of being real beyond what I can see. I think there is a comfort in that, and kind of something that gives our life greater meaning. Currently that's not something I can like logic out. But I do miss those two things, and I do appreciate like your honesty and talking about this, because I never could have had this conversation with you when I was a kid, not because I wouldn't have been prepared for it, and you weren't in that place either.
Neither one of us were in that place, but Rob and I we have those conversations too. And, we look back at that time, and I mean, it was a special time. It really was. Like, the community we had it's hard to explain to other people, it really is. So.
Well, man, I appreciate you doing this, and I'm serious. Like maybe we can do something else down the road again. I think people need to hear the way that you described a religion and a belief system. I think that you're right. Has sort of positioned itself in a certain way that's probably it's an antithesis to what it wants to be. Yep. And I think good conversations like this can maybe broaden people's understanding of really what the true message of that is. So
I hope so. Yeah. Love it.
Thanks, buddy. I appreciate it. It was good talking to you, and let's do it again sometime.
Yeah, man. Love it. Good talking to you, my friend.